thinking a lot about cows lately. The New York Times devoted its entire food section to climate change. It was great and very important, and also it sucked. At least it did for us omnivores. I'm sure the vegans felt pretty smug about it because it contained passages like this. Meat and dairy, particularly from cows, have an outsized impact, with livestock accounting for around 14.5% of the world's greenhouse gases each year. Our next guest is also someone who has thought deeply about cows, sometimes while he's up to his elbows in a vaginal passage. John Connell has a new memoir out called The Farmer's Son, and in it he details his return to his family's farm in Ireland over the course of a calving season. Welcome, John.
Thank you, and a great way to get introduced.
So let's start a little bit with how the book opens. You're delivering a calf. You're helping a cow deliver a calf.
Yeah.
It seems like a very grueling and gruesome process.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose above all, it's a joyful thing and it's a beautiful thing. But as so often for many farmers with cows, you have to give the cow a hand. And the book starts with me being 29 years of age, delivering this calf by myself for the first time, which is very old for a farmer's son. But I'd been away for a long time, and it was a really it was fun, but it was stressful. And the birth of the calf was also the birth of the book, because for a long time I had wrote different things, but none had been about me and my life. And I was following that old thing of write what you know, but writing what you know involved having your hand up a cow's passage to find out what that was.
It seems like a very complicated procedure. I was surprised to find out that it involves ropes and a winch.
Yeah.
How did cows give birth before farmers had a rope and a winch standing around?
Yeah, so the cows would have been a lot smaller, and the calves would have been smaller, and the mortality rate would have been higher. Not every, as in the wild, not every birth was successful. Because cattle are worth so much more money, we have to be there, and we've bred them to be bigger because they're beef cattle. So you got to be there to help. Now, more often than not, a lot of them do it themselves, but some can't. So we have to be there to supervise.
Right. So talk to me a little bit about how you came to write this book. You mentioned that you had been writing for years before this, but not your own story. How did you find yourself back on your family farm at age 29?
Yeah, well, I had been, like yourself, I'd been a journalist and a filmmaker, and I'd ended up living in Australia. I'd went as a student and ended up becoming a permanent resident and had a production company and made human rights programs. And life was great until it wasn't. And there's no easy way to say it, but I had some mental health problems, and I decided to come home under the pretext to write, but really it was to get better. And I wrote 2 books before this. I wrote one about JFK and one about the Syrian refugee crisis. But the last time I checked, I wasn't a Kennedy, and I certainly wasn't Syrian. So
Right.
Those weren't my stories to tell. And it was at the request of my agent saying, well, you're working on a farm, maybe you should write about this. And I resisted for a very long time. But actually that's the thing I should have done. And farming was the thing that brought me back to the positive now moment. It was a very healing and restorative thing for me, and it allowed me to see the extraordinary ordinariness and beauty of life.
And you write a little bit about how coming home was not without its own issues. In particular, you and your father have a complicated relationship. Can you talk to me a little bit about why that was so fraught, and maybe some of your fears about coming back to work with him on the farm?
So I suppose every farming family has this. It's nothing unique. I suppose fathers and sons on farms, and fathers and daughters and mothers and daughters, they can be like 2 bulls in a field. You can't really have 2 bulls in a field because one has to be the boss. And I was coming in trying to, I suppose, undermine his ideas and saying, well, if we should switch to organic, we should do this, and let's try to bring our carbon footprint down. And you're going against generations of farming and ritual and culture. So we were trying to get to know each other, really. And I'd been away for so long as an immigrant. So coming back, here I was as an adult, and with an adult's personality. So we had to find a way of being. And the book, while it's about farming and all this, but really it's a book about life, and it's a book about family and how intergenerational issues come up in every family, and how we deal with them.
You write about how he sacrificed for you, and about how there was hope that your generation would be the first one who wouldn't have to emigrate. And then, of course, the Celtic Tiger collapsed in 2008-ish, and you did, in fact, emigrate. I guess you emigrated before that to go to college?
Yeah, I mean, my name was picked out of a hat, probably not unlike this one, to go to Australia and as an exchange student. And in the first few months I was there, the crash happened. So there was no way to come back, really. There wasn't a career to be had. And at the height of the recession, there was something like 30,000 people leaving a month. So it was a ground zero place. And there was a great sadness, I think, in my parents' generation and the baby boomers' generation, because all we'd ever known was leaving. And then this generation were going to be able to stay, build the country, and the knowledge base wouldn't leave.
You talk also about when you did come home, the importance of being back on the land, and about how in many ways it replicated things that you had heard from Aboriginal Australians or Indigenous Canadians, and about especially, this land as a place of genocide. During the famine, and about how important it was to sort of be back on the land and working with the land.
Yeah, so we have a phrase in Ireland, in Gaelic, and it's Baile agus Baha, and it means the place of connection, or the driach, the magic of the place. And I worked with Aboriginal people a lot in Australia as a journalist, and have many Aboriginal friends, and the way they view the world, it's very similar to Irish people. And of course, their history is a similar history of genocide and usurpation. So the land is a healing thing, and it brings us connection. And it was funny, actually. It was also another side of it, which I didn't talk about in the book, but Henry David Thoreau's writings really influenced me. So American Transcendentalism, seeing God in nature, and whatever manifestation you want to take of God. But there is a extraordinary healing power in the land, and a rootedness. And of course, coming from a rural place, those fields shaped my soul. And then when you live in a city, it can be hard to feel the natural connection. A city can give you everything, but when you're burnt out, we all have to find that balance of biophilia, of nature, because it is what we came from, and it is what heals and restores us, but also maintains us.
I wasn't kidding about thinking a lot about cows lately. I am thinking a lot about cows lately. I really enjoy dairy products and meat, and I don't feel like it's a moral issue for me about, the sanctity of an animal life. But at the same time, I feel like someone like you should be able to eat all the meat and dairy that you want, because you have a connection to the animal and that process of life and death in a way that I don't. Tell me how to feel.
That's the issue of 2019, I suppose. Right. Look, the way it is at the moment, we're going to be getting up on 10 billion people soon, and there isn't enough land to produce all the food we need. So we have to think smart about it. The milk and dairy and beef that we produce in Ireland is on a very small scale. We're working in harmony with nature. So it's easier to consume that product. But then you put a cow in a feedlot in the US or Australia, it's not just America, and the whole dynamic changes, because the cow is not allowed to be a cow in a sense. It's not being able to be in nature itself, being grass-fed and pasture-raised. I think the issue at the moment is it's about the flow of information, and when people hear about someone eating meat and say it's from the vegan community, they say, well, you're a terrible person for doing that. But it's actually like, well, if you explain that this came from a family farm and there's 30 cows there, and the mom and pop absolutely know all these cows and love them, and these cows put the kids through school, no one is making a fortune on it. There's nothing wrong with consuming that meat or that milk. But when we get into big ag, we're getting into a very complex and at times very shady and corrupt world. If we're to look down south to Brazil, Brazil is being looked at as a leader in beef production, and as the Chinese market, it's all connected. So China wants to eat more meat; they don't have the land to produce it, so they're looking to Brazil to produce more meat. But in order for Brazil to produce more meat, they have to cut down more rainforests. But there's also a human cost to that because they're inward migrants who are forced into modern slavery to work on these beef farms. And there's about up to 100,000 people who are modern slaves working on beef farms in Brazil. So food is very, very political.
Let me ask you about cow farts. There's been a lot of talk
methane,
about
yes.
cow farts lately. And it turns out that actually cow burps emit more methane than cow farts, which I didn't know as somebody who's not around cows. But it seems like a very smelly business being around cows.
It can be. You see, some of those farts and burps are contributed to the grain that we're feeding cattle to put on more weight, and they can't break it down because they're not designed.
Do they have celiac disease?
Well, I'm not sure, but they're not really designed to eat grain. They're designed to eat grass.
Even the cows should go gluten-free.
Well, yeah, exactly. and they're having trouble digesting it, so they burp more, and the gases are released. That's a big issue. Like the carbon emissions or the methane emissions from cows in Ireland is a huge section of our emissions. And I know globally it's a big one. We just have to farm smartly with it. But when you get into a situation with a massive feedlot with 10,000 head of cattle, that's a whole lot of methane going up into the environment.
So your book was very successful in Ireland, and it was not called A Farmer's Son in Ireland, right?
No, it was called The Cow Book, which was a joke title. I wrote several drafts, and they were all rejected. And in the end, my parish priest, who's a good friend, he used to just call it The Cow Book, and I said, "Oh, screw it! We'll put it in one last time and call it The Cow Book as a joke." And it got accepted,
and it stuck.
And the book has yes, it spent 35 weeks in the bestseller list in Ireland, and it's won all these awards, and they call me the Cowman now. So
good for you. You've made it.
I've made it. It's unusual to get a nickname like that, and but Irish people love labeling people. So I'm the Cowman.
It sounds like it was tremendously resonant in Ireland, especially among people who hadn't seen themselves and their way of life depicted in a book before.
Well, you see, if you come from a rural community anywhere, you never see yourself in the media. There's maybe the odd TV show here or there, but because most media is made in the urban environment, we don't see ourselves reflected. Now, I used to make TV, so I know this. So when the book came out, it touched a lot of people, and farming is the second biggest indigenous sector in the country. So there are 100,000 farmers, but there's probably 250,000 people who are linked to the land in some way. You don't have to go back very far to scratch to find someone who has farming roots. So it allowed people who perhaps had left the land to come back to it in a sense. And in America too, you know, the book's actually went to number one already.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So it's been an interesting thing because I think farmers here share a lot of the similar problems that we do, and they also they at times have felt that they haven't been listened to. So we've been talking with Farm Aid about the book, who I know do amazing work, but the amazing thing out of that conversation was issues that I thought were unique to Ireland were exactly the same as here, particularly farmer suicide in the Midwest, and that's very high. And rural communities, not only do we need to see reflections of ourselves, we need to hear positive stories. We could read a million hillbilly elegies if we want, but sometimes you need to hear a story about someone who came back and who's working on the land and things are good, rather than this is bad, this is crap, everyone's dying, or we have an opioid problem in a rural area.
Sure.
You want to hear a positive story.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that you are a young man with promise, with other options, with other countries to live in, who has come back to the land by choice, and finds great solace there, and that you find your life transformed for the better by being there is a very hopeful story. Yeah. But we are, however, sitting here in Brooklyn.
Yes, we are.
Many of the people who will be listening to the show and watching the show are not from agrarian backgrounds. Talk to me about what this book offers for people who are not rural farmers.
Well, really, the book is a book about a man falling in love with life again after a bad time, and I think there's a universality to that. Yes, it's about cows and farming, but it's a philosophical work. Really, it's about finding happiness. That really is what the book is about finding joy. We live in a world where individualism has been favoured over everything, but it has created the biggest isolation problem in the world. This is a book about finding community. Western society has created a situation where we all feel alone, but we're not, you know. And a city, you can feel even more alone than anywhere else. But actually, communities all around. The book is about a guy who has been an outsider coming into a community and finding it, embracing him again.
Well, it's a beautiful book, and it's almost deceptive in its simplicity. It feels very approachable, but it has all of these wonderful underlying messages, and I recommend people read it on a weekend upstate where they leave their phone at home.
Okay.
John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.